94% of registered voters, both Democrats and Republicans, say that violent crime is a major or minor issue in the U.S., according to a recent Morning Consult political poll. Approval of Joe Biden's handling of public safety fell along party lines, with 87% of Democrats saying he's doing a good job, compared to only 16% of Republicans.
Now, recently, the White House urged state and local governments to put leftover COVID funding towards building a more robust police presence, especially in communities experiencing an increase in gun violence. Journalist and co-founder of Inquire More, Zaid Jilani, joins us now to discuss. Zaid, welcome back.
Yeah, good to be here.
Absolutely. Could you talk a little bit about the reality versus the political conversation? So, like, what the reality is of the crime increases, because it's different in different areas of crime, and then the way that it's sort of being discussed in the political discourse?
Yeah, I mean, the political discourse is interesting because I think we often look to the president to solve problems. You know, they're obviously the largest and tallest political figure in the country. But to a large extent, criminal justice is a state and local issue, right? It's administered by municipalities. Most people who are in jail or in prison are in state prisons or local prisons, or they're in jail waiting for trial. The federal government has a role to play for sure, but I do think that we tend to oversell or overplay that role. The primary task that they would have would be, one, they have obviously the federal law enforcement system and the prisons, but for what we're talking about right now, which is basically an increase in shootings and homicides, I would say their main role is probably based on resources, right? Over the past year, we didn't really see a big increase in most types of crime in most parts of the country. In fact, crime actually went down, probably due to the lockdowns. It certainly did in most of the world for that reason. But there was a significant increase in shootings and homicides, and that increase is uneven. In some parts of the country, the increase might have been like 20% or something like that, which is certainly considerable. In other parts, it was much higher. There were a few cities like St. Louis that had the worst number of murders, I think, in any time in 50 years. Birmingham had the worst in 25 years. So again, it's really uneven. I think sometimes when we talk about crime, we think about it as being uniform or distributed evenly across the country. But actually, there's probably a few pockets that are driving a lot of the increase, I would argue. And it's not even like I just mentioned a couple cities. It's really not cities either. Like, there are parts, like Chicago is always in the news for violent crime, but there are parts of Chicago that are just as safe as being in, like, Switzerland, Davos or Geneva or something, right? Like, there are extremely safe parts of Chicago as well. But the violence that's concentrated, though, it actually would rival what you would see in parts of the developing world. In certain neighborhoods. So I think that's really when Biden is addressing this issue, as he's starting to now. I think over the past few weeks, he's recognized the salience of it, and he's announcing some measures. He needs to really look at that hyper-local response. Talking about, all of America as awash in crime is not really the right way to talk about it. There was a generalized increase across the U.S. in violent crime, but it's very, very concentrated in a few, I would argue, localities. And I think that's, to the extent the federal government can lay out resources to supplement state and local responses, that's kind of how I would think about it.
There was an interesting Twitter thread over the weekend, Zed, where somebody was making the argument that once you get past this question of who's soft on crime, who's tough on crime, who's recognizing crime rates increasing, who's ignoring crime rates increasing, that the people who call themselves tough on crime don't actually have anything to back that up, in the sense that nothing that they've really proposed in the past has had much of an effect on crime rates, unless you want to say that locking up a couple million people eventually, by keeping them in cages, kept crime rates low, for some period of time. But on the other side, within the criminal justice reform movement, outside of the kind of like prison abolition crowd, you actually have a very serious focus on evidence-driven ways to reduce crime. So where do you come down on what the best way to actually reduce violent crime is? Or what suite of policies?
Yeah, I mean, there isn't a silver bullet for something like this, and that it's probably too complicated for there to be a policy like that. But that being said, I would say that there were, we shouldn't be hopeless when we're looking at 25-year, in some parts of the country, 50-year highs in shootings and violence, because the good thing about it being a 25-year high or a 50-year high means that it was falling previously, right? Up until, I would argue, maybe the 2013 or 2014, in most parts of the country, crime was falling precipitously, including violent crime, fell throughout the Great Recession, which surprised a lot of people. And I think that points to the reality that we don't have to have such high levels, right? We're perfectly capable of being a safer place. And I think the biggest decrease in violence happened in the 1990s, right? The decrease was so sharp that it actually expanded the life expectancy of Black men, which is, I think, the demographic where homicide is most common, right? The life expectancy gap between white men and Black men actually closed somewhat in the 1990s thanks to that. And so what happened in the 1990s, I would argue there were two big factors. One was the abatement of lead. So lead is an element that, we try to get rid of it in our communities for a number of reasons. It can cause all kinds of health issues. But there's actually a lot of research out there now that suggests that lead actually led to more kind of criminal inhibition, like people's ability to control their impulses and their behavior was actually reduced by high levels of lead. And of course, lead tended to be most prevalent in sort of lower income areas, tended to be prevalent in the inner city. And so the mass removal of that for several decades, I think, started to pay off. And so we saw less criminal activity as a result of that. The other major component in the 1990s was that there was an increase in policing, particularly community-oriented policing in many parts of the country, which I think did serve as a deterrent effect and also an incapacitation effect, meaning that, yes, the number of people behind bars grew, but many of those people had committed violent crimes. I think something like 50% of the prison population is there for some form of violent crime. And that did have some effect, or some positive effect, I think, in the 1990s. So, I wouldn't say there's any one policy. There are also other, smaller policies, for instance, giving kids jobs during the summer. If you want kids in Chicago not to join a gang or not to be using their time with the wrong crowd, you should hire them to do something, pay them 12, 13, 14. I mean, if the federal government's paying for it, pay them $15 an hour, right? To go and do something great in their communities, to be involved with some type of summer job program. It could be anything. It could be painting buildings, could be working with younger kids. It could be, taking care of the elderly. There's all kinds of jobs out there to do. I think the federal government should be investing much more in that to keep, teenagers and particularly people maybe in their early 20s who might be without work, might be without school, give them something to do. So, I would never argue that I have the magic, the magic solution to all this. But I think it starts with recognizing the problem. I don't think the problems just kind of solve themselves. And I think the fact that Biden has come out and done that now is helpful. Now I do want to reiterate that I do think it's primarily a state and local problem. I think states and localities have to coordinate all these responses primarily. But the feds can pony up some money and offer some resources for that. And I think that would be a good move for Biden. So.
Conspicuously absent from your explanations, Zed, is the scourge of violent video games. You actually tweeted that in the Obama administration, Joe Biden himself once blamed video games for the rates of gun violence in America, and even floated the idea that media and entertainment companies who portray violence should be subjected to a special tax. What does that tell us about Biden's approach right now? Is he the man for this moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because Biden did float that as vice president. He hasn't really brought it up again, which hopefully in my mind means he figured out it was not a good idea. But I think the reason I brought that up was not necessarily just the crime surge, but it was because, over the past week, he accused Facebook of killing people. And it's I'm a critic of Facebook too, for many reasons. But I think Biden does sometimes throughout his career have a habit of being kind of a knee-jerk reactionary and kind of finding a scapegoat and kind of driving that. And I think the violent video game thing was an example of that. In the 90s, of course, it was rap music and movies, entertainment. And it's sort of understandable people might draw that connection because particularly in the 80s and 90s, you saw for the first time things like violent video games, right? You saw for the first time very graphic and explicit music and movies, and people of course would be curious about what impact that would have. But over the long term, I don't think we saw a huge impact from those things. And if anything, people who maybe have a little bit of proclivity towards those attitudes or behaviors already, maybe then when they use those products, they get a little bit more, agitated or aggressive. But that's why we have a rating system. That's why parents need to watch what their kids are doing and, wait till they're mature before doing, partaking in some of that stuff. And I think, this time I think Biden is not, hopefully, he's not going to go down the violent video game route because, they play violent video games in Japan and South Korea and, there more people got murdered in Chicago last year than got murdered in the entire country of Japan. So, I don't think it's the video games. So,
Well, Zaid Jilani, thank you so much for joining us. And we'll have more Rising for you right after this.